Tell us why you were in China.
Well, I went out there in '39 and had to go up to the Yangtze River, about 600 miles, to our, I guess you say our outpost there was the logistic situation for the gunboats. And I was in charge of that little ditty there, but we had very few gunboats left. There was one time 7 or so, but we only had 3 left because the situation was getting down to that point. You didn't want to lose too much because you had to lose them. So I was there better part of a year when I had this circulatory trouble and had to get out, go to a hospital.
What date was that?
That was 1939, early 40. And I flew up in a Japanese plane because just any old transportation wasn't available because the Japanese had occupied all the ports and rivers, river ports and things of that sort. So we were under Jap control, but they didn't give us any trouble, and we tried not to give them any.
This was in what year?
Early 1940. About this particular duty was that I sort of enjoyed a rare practice of stowing everything contrary to usual rules for fire prevention, so that if it caught fire, it would burn well. You know, putting paint and so forth where it'd do the most good.
This was in the Philippines.
Yeah, no, this was in China, because we expected the Japanese to eventually move in, and when we did, we wanted to give them a good party, you know, have a nice fire down there. But then I had to leave sort of the same way I arrived, by a Japanese military plane, and went to a little hospital we have, so-called hospital in Shanghai for the 4th Marines, and to get my problem doctored up, and then from that point I went to the Navy Purchasing Office, which at one time was a very busy little place, but by the time I got there it was slowed down to just a sort of a creeping operation, waiting for the big event, you know, which everybody knew was coming. Well, I wasn't there long until they started thinning that place out. So I was shipped down to the Philippines and wound up in Mariveles in Bataan, which is just across the North Channel from Corregidor. And they were building what they called a section base, and we had no idea what it was for, and I don't think anybody ever found out before the war started. We think it had something to do with submarine relief crews. You know, they had 2 crews for every submarine, so that, well, just make things a little more bearable for the people who were out on duty to come back and have a little respite from their life in a submarine. But anyway, we were stocking up these mini buildings full of dry stores, in other words, non-refrigerated stores. And we lived rather primitively in a same kind of a building. And we were in that kind of a situation when Pearl Harbor happened.
And that was December the 7th?
Yeah, yeah.
19...
The 8th over there.
Well, it was December the 8th in the Philippines.
But we had little field-type phones like the land forces have strung out around, and the phone was ringing about, I don't know, 1 o'clock, something like that. And my boss, we were all living in a room, like, because it wasn't a very fancy place. I mean, we didn't have individual rooms, so my boss got up and answered the phone, and it said the Japs were bombing Pearl Harbor. And the little power station across the creek was wailing over there, and So from that time on, we had a little problem on our hands. And my impression I had, the longest lasting impression I had was all the rules go out the window. You know, we're not accountable for every little thing like we ordinarily are. And it's just about face from the usual peacetime. And of course, it didn't take any time for the Jap planes to start coming over because we were between them and Manila.
And what kind of job did you have in the Navy then?
Well, I was in supply, and either in money or stores. You usually took care of one or the other, but not both. So I was both there because we didn't have a large outfit, and we took care of the paydays and as well as the stores. But Japanese planes started coming over, and of course that was everybody's first experience in combat, or however early it was. But you get the impression each one of those was looking for you, and you're going to drop something down in your hip pocket. We had no preparations or had been made for cover. After all, you got to have some place to hide, and we scratched out a few things that would answer as a foxhole until the civilian contractor, who was very busy around there building things, and went into the side of the mountain and dug a U-shaped tunnel in there where you could go from either end. And we got set up in there with a sick bay and a supply office, or dispersing office.
Was that tunnel the same kind of tunnel that MacArthur and...
In the rough. It was, MacArthur had one that was all concrete inside, and I guess at one time might have been wallpapered, I don't know, but ours was just out of the rock. No fancy gimmicks at all. And we slept in there, and we didn't eat in there. We would if we could have, but had to go somewhere else for his chow. Suddenly, on Christmas Day, we started having company. The Americans from all services and all the area was coming in because it was the Orange Plan to make our last stand at Mariveles on the Bataan Peninsula. But we hadn't heard of the Orange Plan, so we didn't know what was going on. We soon found out, of course, they were looking for some place to be except in Manila, because it was long since unhealthy to be there.
Tell us about the Orange Plan.
Well, all we knew what it was just a matter of where the Americans were going to make their last stand, and the Filipinos, were all in the same boat, make our last stand on Bataan, and which they did, of course. I can't help but remember how sad it was to see these boys come back from up in the front where the action was. On their days off, they'd come back looking for something to eat. And of course, we would dish them out food when we could. But the boss finally told us we'd have to quit that. And these fellows who were already down probably 15% of their normal weight, we had to turn them away, and that was real heartbreaking to have to do that. But let's see, we're around Christmas time when they all came down to Bataan, and from there until 8th of April, we were just sort of putting in our time. We had a few bombings there, but really the Japs were after a lot bigger things than the section base. I was awakened one night in this tunnel office of ours by my my partner, Bill Lathy, to tell me that the Japs were overrunning the front lines and for us to get out any way we could. And the boss had told him to tell me that to take the money and get to Corregidor if I could, just to take the paper money. But I guess I got some scotch somewhere in, and I put all the coins and everything in there. It was pretty heavy. And I go down to the dock, which is, I guess, 3 blocks away or something like that, and looking for a way to get to Corregidor. And I found a little steamer there. We'd call them 680 boats, just a utility boat that worked out of the Navy Yard. And I guess I was about the last one on that thing, and we shoved off. And we got about midway to Corregidor when all Bataan seemed to explode. They were destroying the ammunition dumps over there. It was a pyrotechnic display that I'll probably never see again. I think it probably had Disneyland beat all the holler.
How about the Statue of Liberty celebration?
Well,
Compared to
yeah, I think it would compare real well. So, everything was in chaos, you might say, and we got to Corregidor, and there were beach masters down there to tell us where to go. They told me to go up to so-and-so battery. I don't remember which one they told me, but I explained to them what I had in this bag and what my boss had told me. And they were still going to send me up to the coast artillery installation. And finally, I don't know, somehow, I can't explain it, but they gave in and told me to carry out my boss's orders. So I found the Molina Tunnel, and the Navy had a lateral going off it. And that's where I wound up for the duration of Corregidor's part in this story. In there, the boss gave me a safe to keep this money in and told me to pay anybody that came around with a pay receipt, without regard to what they might have in the books, because the books were, nobody knew anything about them. So that was easy, of course. There was no use for any money because no place to spend it. There was a game going on, and once in a while, one of these fellows, would have to replenish his earnings, his loot, so he'd come and cash a pay receipt. That went on like that. The food, of course, was getting scarcer or lesser. The water was getting more brackish, and everybody knew what was up ahead. For a long time, we had hopes that there'd be some ships show up, but we'd given that up quite a while back. And we knew what was coming. We just hoped it would be as easy as could be. So one day early in April, when we began to smell paper burning, why we knew it had arrived. And the Japs had come over during the night with tanks. We were landing on the beaches. And I guess from about midnight on, there was a battle going on at what they call Monkey Point, about the only place they could land. And so we went out to the back of the tunnel. We could hear all the ugly noises over there, and we, of course, we knew what was the ultimate, because we couldn't hold off the forces that were bound to be attacking. So as history will tell us, why the General Wainwright had to surrender the forces in the Philippines. He first tried to surrender Corregidor only, and the Japs wouldn't have any part of that. They forced him to surrender the whole islands.
Put it in perspective then, what was the length of time between the time Pearl Harbor was bombed and the time the Japs came to Corregidor?
Well, Pearl Harbor was, I'd say, the 8th of January, and Corregidor was the 8th of April, so it was exactly 4 months. I see, 4 or 5. I won't do my arithmetic here, but you can tell it was long. And it was approximately a month after that until Corregidor folded up. And so I'm frequently asked about what it's like to be taken a prisoner of war, but the kind that went on there was unlike most instances of POWs having to surrender, because it was done for us, you might say, wholesale. General Wainwright was doing this over on a peninsula to General Homa. And so in a matter of a day or so, we saw our first Japanese coming up through the tunnel, and they were not belligerent or anything like that. They were looking, we didn't know it right then, but they were looking for something to eat like everybody else. So they'd get these number 10 tins of fruit and just hack them over. If there wasn't pineapple, they threw them away and went on. Well, in a day or so, we were told to get our gear together with emphasis on any food we could scrounge around, and to form ranks back of the tunnel, and they'd direct us from that point. So we went down to an area called 92nd Garage, which is just a great big, huge slab with a hangar-type building over there. The place was practically all shell hold. I mean, you know, packed with shell bursts, and we stayed there until Decoration Day or Memorial Day. That was from the 6th of May until the 30th of May, when they took us over to the Cavite side, and they had I believe two ships, two old Maroos, we called them, and we put in those things and taken over and landed like they had to do their landings. They made us get out of boats and wade ashore because there were no docks. And then we formed ranks up on the beach and started marching toward Manila. And that's where I had my trouble. I couldn't walk any distance at all. And when it was obvious I couldn't go any further, I had no choice but to hit the pavement, which I did. Well, it didn't take long for a Japanese to come along with what we called a vitamin stick and try to get me to do a little more marching. Well, it just wouldn't work. I couldn't do it. So I guess he was a little smarter than the average Jap, because he gave me this stick to hold up, which is a signal to the trucker that would come along later to pick up stragglers. And so I wound up in what they call Billabid Prison, which was a sort of a famous place in the Philippines. It didn't have a very good name. And we thought that we would probably spend our time there as prisoners, but that wasn't the way it worked out. That was just a clearinghouse on a few days, and that's where we got our first food from. Up to that point, we had to do what we could, and what that was to get a group together, and the Japs would let us go on a little foraging trip and go up to any bunkers or foxholes and get anything we could find to eat. Water was the same way. You had to go up and get water the same way until they built a 3/4-inch line down there for about 15,000 people. So we were put on a train and headed north in Luzon, and we got to the little town of Cabanatuan and disembarked the train. It was cattle cars. And one little incident I remember that's, I think, human in this story was one place we stopped. For what reason, I don't know, because we weren't taking on any passengers or putting any off, but we stopped anyway. The doors opened, and by this time, anyone who had any reason to have some of these tropical diseases that was their time to come forward, because we had a lot of people that had it. And if you can imagine 100 men in one of these little box cars and no place to go when you had to go, it was pretty bad. And it was we were packed in there just like you were all standing, no place to do anything else. So one place, they opened the door, right there was a schoolhouse. It wasn't 100 feet from railroad tracks. All the kids came out, and we thought the Japs were going to show them the prisoners and what they could do to the Occidentals, you know. And just as we started off, a bunch of stuff flew in the door. It looked like we thought it was cabbages or something, and we thought that the Filipinos were not being very kind to us, you know, throwing us a bunch of garbage. It developed that it was the school kids' lunch. When they went to school, their parents would take a palm leaf and pack it with rice, cooked rice, roll it up into a ball, and they'd take it to school that way. It's all they had was just rice, and that's what they were throwing us. And we were gone before we had any way of knowing that, and couldn't even say thanks. Anyway, when we got to this Cabana de Juan, we stayed under a schoolhouse all night, which was the only place we could find any shelter. And that was just for overnight. The next day we started for this place that we were to stay most of the time, and referred to as Cabana de Juan number 1. And that was a place that had been built for the Philippine Army. And there are buildings, I guess about 30 by 70 or something like that, with upstairs and downstairs arrangements on each side of the aisle going lengthwise, and those decks were made out of split bamboo, and we had a blanket to go on them. That was the way we were to live. And the sides were made out of what they call swallow, which is just woven split bamboo, and the top was thatched. For prisoners of war, you couldn't ask for much more. Some people think you could, but I never thought so. POWs don't have much prestige, you know. You gotta take what you can get. I've been asked to describe a typical day. Well, I think it'd be hard to do because there just aren't any. One day can be different from the next, and I mean, very much different. But just to keep this thing in chronological order, this camp, I guess, was about roughly, I'd say, 20 acres in area, and a road going up through the center of it, and the Japs' quarters were adjacent to this road. So we first went to one side of the camp and set up in these buildings. And it didn't make any difference how many buildings you had. They put as many as they could in the building until it was full, and you could have several vacancies down the way, and that didn't matter to them. But that is where my worst experience as a POW. And I didn't suffer so much myself, perhaps, but I was witness to it. Because we had, right from the first, we had about 70 people a day die for one reason or another, usually dysentery or beriberi or what's the mosquito-laden malaria, yeah. I don't know just exactly how this came about, but I guess after 3 or 4 months in this situation, which was not good and not getting much better, we moved to the other side. You might say that our kitchens were rather crude. I guess it about the best they could do, but just take one of these quality huts, they called it, and make a rice cooker over a wood fire, and that was mostly our ration. Usually they tried to have one vegetable with the rice, and that would be either sweet potatoes or they had can't think of the name of the root now. It's what they make tapioca out of. You can stew it like Irish potatoes. It's very much like it. But they moved across the road to the other side, and Colonel Beecher, I think, of the Marines, might have contributed this bit of luck, because from that time on, things began to improve. We had over there 3 sections to the camp, just for better administration. and we had a headquarters building with all the doodads that go with it. You wouldn't think you'd find that in a prison camp, but we had our own commanding officer, and he had his staff and whatnot, and even had a typewriter with a yeoman, and formal complaints were reported in the proper fashion, and you would think a POW couldn't complain, but they did, and I guess a lot of good was done that way. Well, eventually this circulatory trouble caught up with me, and I had to have my left leg amputated, and we had a lot of doctors of our own. We had lots of talent there, and fortunately for me, hadn't been too long before that they had sent working parties down to Bataan to dig out all the hospital gear they could. So we had that and some anesthesia, and that was a lucky break for me, because if I'd had to take this leg off without it, I guess I'd have had to have done otherwise.
Who sent the working parties down to Bataan? That's an interesting point.
The Japs.
Why did they do that?
Well,
Humanitarian, or?
Well, I suppose so. Someday I guess they figured they might have to answer, and you wouldn't think that they would bother if they thought they were going to be victorious. But I guess all Japs have a good streak in them somewhere. At least that seems so. And we couldn't tell. Their behavior varied. It'd be good a while and bad a while, and never could tell what was causing it, because they might be winning, and you'd think in that case they'd enjoy a little more brutality than they would normally. We don't know, and I never tried to find out. I'm too glad for the good part. But everybody, of course, lost a lot of weight. Where I normally, before the war, weighed 175 pounds, I was down to a little under 100. And during that time, we had to develop all kinds of entertainment or things to occupy your time. And there were classes in everything from advanced math to history and English and whatnot. Anybody that thought there was an authority that came forth to be a professor of this class even had a little combo 5-piece, I guess, band. So we had, strange, they had a fellow in camp who's a civilian that was a gambler in Manila before the war. And he had gone along with the Army everywhere, expecting it to be a short situation, and he'd be back in Manila with his gambling again. Well, of course, he didn't go back because he'd already made his bed and he's going to have to lie in it. Well, he still had a lot of friends in Manila. And it's strange, it's hard to understand how they can make contact, but they did somehow. And he got band instruments up there, a little piano, and saxophone, trumpet, drums, and whatnot. And this didn't last very long, but we had it for a little while. Well, in connection with this amputation, I don't want to forget, perhaps I can thank this sergeant in the Army Corps of Engineers who made me a leg. I never got to thank him any other way. But the wood detail that went out every day to get wood for these various kitchens, with them, he got them to bring a piece of Filipino balsa wood back. And he made me an old-fashioned peg leg. And he had it ready by the time I was ready. And everybody in camp that had anything that would help out, well, they contributed it. So I had a belt and some sponge rubber and various things to make this thing work. And I got around pretty good, considering I wasn't used to it, and it had no knee, and it was a little bit rough terrain sometime. But I made out all right, and after I had this surgery, for some reason I never did find out. I didn't want to question anybody. I was allowed to live on in a surgery ward, and has more benefits than meets the eye. They had some old hospital beds in there. I guess 50 hospital beds. And I don't know why, but I stayed on there and I enjoyed that bed. Back to this little combo, one little thing that happened one day that was amusing, and it was not rehearsed, I know. There was oftentimes Jap planes flying around our camp. They were just on their way somewhere. They were back. They had no interest in us, but the Jap plane was approaching, and this little trumpet player who was laying out at the time, wasn't playing his trumpet, just whips it up like a machine gun, and the drummer gave it all the sound effects, and it was unrehearsed and so spontaneous, everybody just got a big kick out of it. Well, finally they developed something that was that you would hardly believe. You see, the Japanese, the people that were guarding us, I don't know, they certainly weren't seasoned combat people. They were maybe boots, or maybe they were Taiwanese, some of them. But they didn't know beads. They couldn't drive trucks. They couldn't even fix anything. Well, they had radios, and when they would go haywire, they'd bring them over to us to fix. Well, the fellows would make a list of components they needed, and they might list 5 things and just need one. Well, in due time, they accumulated enough to make a radio they own. And it was a shortwave radio, and I never saw it because it was too hush-hush to let everybody be going around and seeing it. I couldn't swear that it existed, but it must have, because we were getting news, probably as early as 44, I don't know, I can't remember exactly. But it was so compact that it fit in a mess kit. Now, I don't know whether they're talking about the canteen part or the other part, but that doesn't matter either. It was concealed, and every night the crew would gather this information, the news, and they were getting, I don't see how this is possible, but it worked. They got KGEI in San Francisco, which was a popular shortwave station in those days. And the next day, we'd know all about the progress of the war, and that began to come to us about the time we had started winning a little bit, and that was heartening.
Sounded like the shades of Hogan's Hero, the popular TV show.
Yeah. So somebody would get a little careless and start bragging to the Japs out on the farm. I didn't say we developed a farm. Outside of the camp, there was acreage available. Of course, the Japs didn't make any difference who owned it. And they developed this farm, and they grew corn and this cassava. That's the root I was talking about that looked like potatoes. And seemed like there was sweet potatoes, corn, and cassava. That's right. We had 3 vegetables, not at one time, but one going all the time. And the able-bodies had to go out on this farm detail. You either went to the farm detail or you went on the wood detail. And a few, like myself, who couldn't go on a detail, enjoyed staying in camp. And it's complimentary of the American spirit to see how a bunch of beaten people like we were when we got there would soon find ways to tidy this place up and make it livable. I mean, little whitewashed rock borders and things like that, and maybe some flowers if they knew where to get some seeds. It's wonderful to reflect back on how that came about. And this Colonel Beecher really knew his organization because it all helped. Well, one of the the biggest concern, the most serious concerns we had from day to day was what's going to happen to you tomorrow. We didn't expect to be lined up and shot or anything like that, but we probably be sent somewhere, and we'd like to know about it so we could have more time to worry about it. So when getting along toward the last, they started shipping more people out to Japan. The Japs had to pay, according to the rules of war, I guess, certain prisoners, they had to pay them, the officers usually, no enlisted men. And they paid them in occupation money, which is not worth much, but we had the privilege of ordering stuff, and each barracks or each unit would make up their orders, and I was the gizmo in our barracks. I made up the order, and this is all summarized in a grand requisition and gave it to the Japanese with our money, and they would bring it in to us. I never had any money, but in being the major domo of the doing the paperwork and the distribution, I got some little gratuities from my work. In the early days of the war that I spoke of in the other section of camp, I remember so well the officer in charge of our building. He made me his assistant, and he'd tell me every night who I could expect to not be alive the next morning. And he was almost 100% right. And then what we would do with the deceased was to take him out under the eaves. So we didn't want to be sleeping there next to them, so they'd stay out there one day, maybe 2 days, till the burial detail could get around to taking them out to the place where they disposed of them. And that place out there was a huge trench made with a bulldozer, and they would take the bodies out there on litters and just throw them into this hole like so much cardwood, and the bulldozer would cover them with a little dirt, just like landfills here for garbage. And then the same thing was done next day. Well, sometimes it would rain hard at night or any time and wash this dirt away or float the bodies sometime. And it isn't a pleasant thing to think about, but neither is a lot of things that goes on with POWs. With the dogs, or some varmints would get in there, of course, and make things very bad for those who had to bring more bodies. We had one building. I'm sort of out of chronological sequence here, but one building was established as the Zero Ward, where people were sent when they knew that they wouldn't survive. That was just to keep those who everybody knew was going to die from dying. Right.
This was in the first camp.
Yeah, I should have mentioned that a while ago. One of the biggest, one of the best days of the whole thing was the day when we had 0 deaths. First day we didn't have any deaths. Of course, that got to be common later on, but it was a day for bell ringing if we'd have had any bells. Well, to get back in order, I might say that that we had a chapel, and we had Protestant and Jewish and Catholic services, and a lot of this could be said from the time that we went down to the 92nd garage on the corridor. Especially the Catholics were holding their mass every morning, and under those conditions, well, I think it's worth mention. And the same thing when we got settled in camp up there, we had church service all the time, like other people, because we had all kinds of conjectures about what it would be like when the end came, however it was coming, whether it's good or bad or however. The Red Cross tried to provide every prisoner anywhere with a Red Cross box, which was I guess roughly a foot square and 4 or 5 inches deep for 1 week for every prisoner anywhere. And we were there, I guess, 125 weeks, something like that, and we got I got 5.5 boxes while we were there. We heard that they were swapping them off in Manila to the girls, or whatever they were worth, whatever the boxes were worth. These boxes had usually some things to eat, peanut butter and jelly and so forth, and some cigarettes, and maybe a toothbrush or whatever. They could cram into a little bottle like that to be usable as a prisoner. One of the practices of the Japanese, and I think other places it was done too, to discourage attempts to escape, they put us all, we were all put in squads of 10, and there was a case of one guilty, all guilty. If somebody tried to escape, or if they did escape, they would shoot the other 9. And I never heard of 9 people getting shot on account of it, but we had one sad case where a friend of mine who was with me in Bataan, who was the construction officer, who was a two-striper, he and 2 Army officers plotted to escape one night. The Japanese forced us to establish our own perimeter guard, and it was our only perimeter guard that caught these people, or they just bumped into them. They couldn't have. It wasn't a very big job to catch them as they were trying to get out. But anyway, the escapees were trying to declare their rights and their responsibilities to escape whenever they could. And the Japs heard the commotion, and they came over to see what it was all about. And they took the 3 into custody. And the next day, they took them down to the where the entrance of the camp, where the road went by the camp, and right where our road joined it. And they tied them up down there to some fence posts. And my building was, I guess, not over 500 yards away, if that far. And we could see all this going on. They just beat them unmercifully. And they'd just stop and then give them something to eat and maybe a smoke, and then they'd take a rest, and then they'd start beating them again. And sometimes they'd get tired of beating them, and they'd stop a Filipino that came along the road, some farmer in his water buffalo and cart, make him get down and beat him a while himself. And so on the 3rd day after I guess they figured they couldn't beat him anymore without beating him to pieces, so a truck went down from headquarters down that way and stopped, and they had some picks and shovels they threw out of the truck, and they had each one of these men pick up a couple and get in the truck, and they took them to a little bamboo grove, which is about the same distance another direction, and unloaded, and you could hear them digging their grave. That's what they made them dig their graves, and they stood them up and shot them so they'd fall into the grave, and then covered them up. And that was the only thing of that sort that happened in my camp that I know of. Well, we all had our ideas of how Liberation Day would come. We imagined that the Yanks would be coming over a little rise in the hill toward Cabana Tawan in their nice shiny tanks, but that isn't the way it happened at all. Quoting from the other side, the unknown side, we found out later, the Senate Ranger Battalion down there from up in Lingayen Gulf to make the rescue, and there were 120 of them, and they gathered a few Philippine guerrillas along the way who came along for backups, I guess, or assistance. But at any rate, they arrived down there the night before we were liberated, and they had intended taking us the night before, which was the 29th of January, 1945. But they found that there was too much military activity to risk it, so they stayed hid out, I guess a mile or so away, and then that was a good break for us too, because they sent a man in the camp to find out what he could, and he took back the information. There was lots of us that couldn't walk, or certainly couldn't walk very far. Some of them were bedridden, so it gave them a chance to scour around the countryside and get some carabao carts, which is a big, heavy two-wheel vehicle that the that the farmers use. And they had about a dozen of those, I guess, out there. And so the night things busted loose was about just after dark on the 30th of January, when we had already turned in, and suddenly all around us was small arms fire. And we thought, first thought we had was the Japs were coming in to finish off the job. And that was in their plan. We found out later they weren't going to give any prisoners back, but they didn't have any choice in this matter. And we estimated later there were about 300 Japs over there. Our regular guards had taken off previously, told us to stay in our compound there, and nothing would harm us. So after they left, other combat people started coming in, some of them with tanks and various things, and they were real ugly-looking people, and we weren't. We thought we'd rather have our guards back, but that isn't the way it worked out. Anyway, we estimated about 300 of them over there, and the surprise was so complete in the Rangers' plan that they didn't know anything was in the countryside, so they were just almost completely destroyed. And as far as we know, they were one of the survivors anyway. And we lost 2 men by can't think of the name of this weapon they use anyway. One of them was a doctor who was the son of a well-known author. Can't think of her name offhand. At any rate, only lost 2 men. The night of the 30th, we were taken out, and we had to make our own way to these carabao carts. And I was carried some of the way because it was dark and the terrain was rough, and my peg leg was not the best way to get around. So some of my friends came along, and I got aboard piggyback, and they took me between 3 of them. They carried me all the way to these carabao carts. And when we got settled in those, we started generally in a northerly direction towards Lingayen Gulf, and we traveled all night. And the Rangers deployed a single file on each side of us, and that was, of course, to protect us in case of attack. And later on, we learned that we had just barely escaped detection from Japanese patrols. But we wound up in a little village that was just swarming with guerrillas, and some of them were kids 12, 13 years old with automatic weapons and bandoliers and ammo around their necks. And we were there, I guess, till midday, and we had a contingent came of from headquarters, and they had a radio, and so he radioed back and reported our progress and asked for transportation. Well, it seemed like no time when big army trucks came in and took us all to an evacuation hospital. Up until that time, we had been theoretically behind Japanese lines, but at that point, we were home at last, you might say. And we stayed there 2 or 3 days and got outfitted and got our tummies full of good American food. And during that time, General MacArthur came down to visit us. He had, I guess, a special interest in paying us a visit because I guess he thought that we had figured he ran off and left us in Corregidor when he went to Australia. But when he saw us, he said, "What's the matter with these people? Still got their POW rags?" He says, "I want these people outfitted and I want them to get the best shower that's available." And we did. From the couple of days we were there, we got the royal treatment. Then we got in some trucks and went on to Lingayen Gulf. And that was just like Robinson Crusoe waking up. We saw ships we would say were aground, the big, huge amphibians that were pulled up to the beach there where all the big stuff had been unloaded and the troops and so forth. And we found a small boat to put us. By that time we had sort of broken up into according to our services. And so we had, I guess, about a dozen naval officers in my group, and we went out to a ship. Before that, I want to mention something that between the time that we left this little guerrilla hotspot and the evacuation hotspot, we were going along a little country road in this truck, and I guess about a dozen of us in this truck that I was in, and we suddenly looked to one side, and there was the American flag was and its flagstaff were lashed to a palm tree, and of course it looked brand new to us, and that was the greatest thing we had seen in 3 years almost. And there wasn't many dry eyes in that truck at that time because we were just too emotionally upset to keep from it. We had an old Norwegian in our group that had piloted a yacht out to the Philippines. It was an intelligence trip that he was gathering information. But anyway, he was a lieutenant, and he was sitting next to me in his truck. He spoke broken English. And he got right up close to the Lingayen Gulf, and he closed his mouth and took a big inhale through his nose, and he says, "Smell dot? Dot salt water."
Salt water.
Salt water. He was an old sailor. He knew when he was home. Well, we were sent out to this ship, Navy supply ship, I guess, or troop ship, something. And we got aboard, and they hadn't been prepped about us coming, and the officer of the deck just didn't know what to do with us. And he sent word down to the captain, he didn't know what to do with us. They finally decided to put us back in a boat and send us some other ship, which they did. And we were on at least a half a dozen ships that day, and we were getting a little weary of that. Not that we could do anything about it. But finally, one of the bunch I was in was a medical doctor in the Navy. And he said, "I know where we can go, and they'll know what to do with us." He pointed to a hospital ship. He turned around and told the coxswain to take us over to that ship. He said, "They'll know what to do with us." So we went aboard that, and they did. They I don't remember how many days we were aboard there in Lingayen, but we got the royal treatment. Ate in the wardroom where the nurses were too, and the last ship I was on in Lingayen Gulf, which is the hospital ship, took us down to Lady Gulf, where the fighting was still pretty severe ashore, and we had a few air raid warnings down here at Raids 2. But we were there 2 or 3 days, and then we got orders to take a certain ship for Hollandia. And when we got down there, we were flown home. Before we left, though, we were told they had some POW camps of our own there, and we wanted to know if we could visit one of them. So they were only too happy to comply, so they took us out to visit this prison camp where we were holding some Japs, and we wanted to make a comparison. Well, they looked like the Reds out there where they were. They weren't doing any work, and they were being fed a regulation ration, and they weren't a bit unhappy. They just assumed the war would go on, I guess. Wouldn't have to go home. Well, we were flown. We had about 3 stops, I guess, before we got home. The last one of which was one of the early big boats that was in service before the war, flying to Honolulu. I can't recall the name of it right now, but we, of course, were allowed 2 or 3 days in Honolulu, in which in case we were put up in the plush hotels and enjoyed the Waikiki and other beaches. And so we got in this large civilian transport and flown home. And one of the greatest sights I ever saw, I guess, was as we flew over the Golden Gate Bridge, and we knew we were home then.